What's up, Group 04? I thought that you could use some help with your eccentric, concentric, antagonist, agonist relationships. So I'm going to do all the movements that we did tonight in class, and I'll be adding more in the future because everybody needs help with this. So we're just going to stick to pairs, mostly front and back pairs, starting with the neck. So in flexion, the flexors are shortening while the extensors are lengthening. Remember, the muscles that shorten, those are contracting concentrically. So there's concentric contraction in the flexors, and the muscles that are lengthening are contracting eccentrically. So there's eccentric contraction in the extensors. These are the agonists that are shortening. These are the antagonists that are lengthening or opposing the agonist concentric contraction. So again, neck flexion, the muscles in the front are shortening, the flexors. Those are the agonists, and they're contracting concentrically. The muscles in the back, the extensors, are lengthening. Those are contracting eccentrically, and those are the antagonists. Shortening, agonist, concentric contraction, prime mover. Lengthening, eccentric, antagonist. Now we're going to do the shoulder. So flexion of the shoulder, extension of the shoulder. Extension is accomplished in part by the posterior deltoid. Flexion is accomplished in part by the anterior deltoid. So in flexion, the anterior deltoid is shortening. It is the agonist. It is contracting concentrically. The posterior deltoid is lengthening. That is an eccentric contraction. It is the antagonist. So in shoulder flexion, the anterior deltoid is shortening. It is the agonist. It contracts concentrically. The posterior deltoid is lengthening. It is the antagonist, which contracts eccentrically. Then it reverses in shoulder extension. The posterior deltoid is shortening, which is concentric contraction. It is the agonist, the prime mover. The anterior deltoid is lengthening. That's an eccentric contraction in the antagonist. External and internal rotation of the shoulder. First, let's drill external and internal rotation in a few different positions because it's always a little confusing. So what I recommend you do is that you look at your humerus or your bicep, tricep, upper arm, whatever, and you imagine arrows going externally, going this way, externally for external rotation, and arrows going this way, internally for internal rotation. Don't look at your hand, don't look at your don't look at your forearm, because if we change positions with those limbs, all that can start to look a little different and be very confusing, right? But if you look at the humerus always will tell you the way that the shoulder joint or the humerus is rotating, externally or internally. So the most common position that you're going to see, and the one that I've seen on practice, MBLEx practice questions, is with the humerus at the side, the elbow at 90 degrees, and with the forearm or the wrist pressing into something like an immovable object. That's, by the way, called isometric contraction, when you press into something and it doesn't move. So this is external rotation. Look at the movement of the humerus, external rotation. And then if you go the other way, here's neutral, go the other way, that's internal rotation. So external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation, do this with me, internal rotation, okay? And if we just straighten the elbows, it's still external rotation, look at the humerus, internal rotation, external rotation, and internal rotation. Now the arms out in a W or a goalpost, this is a very common one, external rotation, internal rotation. Again, external rotation, the humerus going externally or laterally. Internal rotation, with the humerus going internally, right? And then if we straighten the elbow, the movement is the same. Looking at the humerus, external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation, internal rotation. Now, the main muscle that does external rotation of the humerus is the infraspinatus muscle. That's the muscle infra, below the spinous process of the scapula. actually it's not spinous process, it's the spine of the scapula. So infraspinatus means below the spine, right? So the infraspinatus muscle accomplishes external rotation, and then on the other side of the scapula, is the subscapularis, which accomplishes internal rotation. So in external rotation, the infraspinatus is shortening. That's a concentric contraction. It's the agonist muscle and the prime mover. Meanwhile, the subscapularis in external rotation, the subscapularis is lengthening, which is an eccentric contraction of the antagonist. External rotation, infraspinatus shortening, concentric contraction, agonist, prime mover. Meanwhile, the subscapularis muscle is lengthening. That's the eccentric contraction of the antagonist muscle. If we reverse the movement and go to internal rotation, now the subscapularis muscle is shortening. So that makes it the agonist, which is contracting concentrically, the prime mover. And then the infraspinatus is antagonizing the subscapularis. So the infraspinatus is lengthening. That's an eccentric contraction. It is the antagonist muscle. So internal rotation, subscapularis is shortening. That's a concentric contraction of the agonist or prime mover, while the infraspinatus is lengthening. That's the eccentric contraction of the antagonist. In external rotation, the infraspinatus is shortening. That's the concentric contraction of the agonist prime mover, while the subscapularis is lengthening. That's the eccentric contraction of the antagonist muscle. Guys, I didn't get all of this right until I practiced it like tons of times. And still, you're gonna hear me switch the terms now and then. You know, hopefully I catch myself these days. I is an anatomy teacher. Okay, there's my messy desk. All right, so now spinal erector group and abdominals, right? So if we do spine flexion, just get my arms out of the way. If we do spine flexion, my abdominals are shortening, while my spinal erector group are lengthening. So we have shortening, concentric contraction of the agonist muscles, the prime movers, and we have lengthening, the eccentric contraction of the antagonist group. Those are the spinal erectors in the back and the abdomen in the front. If I extend through the spine, then we have the concentric shortening of the agonist in the back, the prime mover, the spinal erector group. And then we have the lengthening of the abdominal muscles, which means these are contracting eccentrically, and they are the antagonist muscles. Let's go downtown. All right, now the hip. We have the hip flexor in the front and the glute in the back. Now, if you get confused with any of these, it helps just to say the front surface, the back surface, like this. In hip flexion, the front surface is shortening, the back surface is lengthening. What muscles are in the front? It's the hip flexor group. What muscles are in the back? It's the glutes. So the hip flexors are shortening, the glutes are lengthening. If we reverse it to hip extension, the muscles in the back are contracting and shortening, the muscles in the front are lengthening. So the glutes are shortening and the hip flexors are lengthening. So in hip flexion, the hip flexor group is shortening. That makes them the agonist muscles, the prime movers, and they're contracting concentrically. Shortening, concentric, agonist, prime mover. The glutes are lengthening, contracting eccentrically. They are the antagonist. Lengthening, antagonist, eccentric, shortening, concentric, agonist. If we reverse the movement for hip extension, we have shortening, concentric, agonist, glute, and then we have the hip flexor, which is lengthening, eccentric, antagonist. Then we'll do the knee and the ankle, and then I'm going to quit. So with knee flexion, we have the hamstring group, and we have the quadriceps group, right? So in knee flexion, the hamstring is shortening, That's a concentric contraction of the agonist, the prime mover. And we have the don't do it, good dog. And then we have the don't do it. Then we have the quadricep group. Oh Lord. Then we have the quadricep group, which is lengthening. That's the eccentric contraction of the antagonist. Shortening, concentric, agonist, prime mover, lengthening, eccentric, antagonist, quadricep, hamstring, quadricep. All right, and then we have knee extension. So now the quadricep, knee extension, the quadricep is shortening, which makes it the concentric agonist prime mover, and the hamstring is lengthening, which makes it the eccentric antagonist muscle. Lengthening hamstring, eccentric antagonist, shortening quadricep, concentric agonist. Okay, and last but not least, we're going to do the movements of the ankle, plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. So we have the tibialis anterior muscle on the front, the shin muscle, and then we have the gastroc and the soleus in the back. So gastroc, soleus, tibialis anterior. So with dorsiflexion, the tibialis anterior is shortening. That's concentric contraction of the agonist prime mover of the tibialis anterior, with eccentric contraction or lengthening of the gastroc and soleus. If we plantar flex, we then have shortening of the gastroc and soleus, which is concentric contraction of the agonist prime movers, and we have lengthening eccentric contraction of the antagonist tibialis anterior. So guys, I hope this helps you. Snaggletooth, dog, and I wish you the best, and we'll be back eventually with some abduction and adduction and some other stuff for the muscles we didn't cover, like the pecs and the rhomboids, etc. Take care.